There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I'm with another Friday Reads. I'm almost outside. I'm sitting beside the patio door. It's a little cool. I think my outdoor videos are finished for the year, but you never know. We could have some balmy days yet. I am doing much better, thanks for asking, if those of you that did. I still don't want to talk about it very much, but things are going quite a bit better, and I have bookish news. Last Sunday was Saskatoon's one-day literary festival. It's called Word on the Street, and I was invited to go with my friend and former prof, Kathy, and then my mom joined us too later in the day. It was fantastic. Here's who I got to see on stage. I didn't see any of these people other than to get a couple books signed in person, have a conversation with them. But Sharon Butala was interviewed in the morning, and it's always great to have a chance to hear Sharon. As you know, if you've been around for long enough, I interviewed Sharon Butala about her new novel, Leaving Wisdom, earlier this year. And then Suzette Mayr, the author of the Giller Prize-winning novel from last year, on a bunch of other prize lists as well. Black lesbian novelist from Calgary, the author of The Sleeping Car Porter. And I watched her on-stage interview, and that was fabulous. And I got 2 books signed, including my own copy of The Sleeping Car Porter, and that was wonderful. And then the final one that we attended was with Michelle Good. Michelle Good is the author of the Governor General's award-winning novel, 5 Little Indians, which didn't work for me. I couldn't finish it. But I have great respect for her, and I've heard her interviewed many times, and she is an Indigenous elder who I revere. I wasn't so crazy about the novel, but her new book of nonfiction called Truth Telling, my mom has read and said it was incredibly powerful, and that'll be the next thing by her that I read. Oh, and actually there was another woman there, Allyson Stevenson, who's written a fairly academic history of the 60s scoop. You might not know what that is, but that's when the social workers scooped up all the Indigenous children of the next generation. They closed the residential schools, so then they had to come up with the new strategy of stealing Indigenous children, and this was what it was, and they were placed in white homes, and that didn't go well. And she's written a history of that I'm looking forward to reading someday. So it was those 2 together. What I also want to say is that Michelle Good read an excerpt from early in her novel that I didn't remember, or certainly didn't remember having so much power, that brought the whole room to tears. So I'm thinking, should I try that novel again? It won a bunch of prizes. Lots of people on BookTube say it's a fine, fine novel, but there's a sizable minority, like me, that didn't think it really was up to snuff. So I think I might, but I'll read the nonfiction book that's just come out recently called Truth Telling first. That's when we left because we had other things to do, but the next session was with David Carpenter, and I did actually find myself in line for the Michelle Good event with David Carpenter behind me, and we had quite a long conversation about reading and books and this and that was one of the highlights of the whole day for me. So it was a fabulous bookish day, and it wasn't over yet, because after Kathy, my mom, and I went out for coffee, I went back to Kathy's place. She recently, not that recently, a year or 2 ago, closed out her English professor office because she's retired from that job. She has another job that she's winding up as well, but then she had boxes of books that she wanted me to go through to see if I wanted any of them, and I did come home with a big bag full, so that was fabulous, and had a lovely dinner with her and her family. So, oh my God, what a lovely day. I think I needed a day out like that to kind of refresh myself. The only other personal news I have is, have any of you noticed how I'm always playing with my chin in recent videos? I never notice it. I'm not conscious of doing it, but then when I get to the edit, I go, Sean, what the hell are you doing? Scratching your chin or doing this all the time. And so it took me weeks to figure out what it is, and it's that my skin is irritated from shaving. I usually always shave just before I my Friday reads, and then it's kind of irritating me. So that's why I'm always doing that. So So after I came back to Canada, I had to find a new straight razor, excuse the pun, and I opted for Chic Bamboo, and I thought it was fine, but then I thought, well, maybe it's the problem. So I didn't even realize until a few minutes ago that in fact, I got a different Chic straight razor, but this one was advertised as being for sensitive skin, and it works like a charm. I shaved yesterday, so I might look a little bit 5 o'clock shadowy. I don't have that much facial hair, so I probably don't, but it was the smoothest shave of my life. I can hardly believe I was shaving. I thought I was just pressing a piece of soft plastic against my cheek, but it gave me a nice close shave, so I think that I won't be fondling my chin today. Let's see how that goes, shall we? I have other exciting news of a Patreon nature. I have a new patron, a new top-tier bibliophile bestie patron who I would like to welcome. They just joined a few days ago. Their name is Max, and they live in Calgary, and I had never heard of them. And they said they found one of my, they found my book review of a Miyako Kawakami novel, and what was that called? Breasts and Eggs, and they've been following me ever since. So how lovely. Thank you so much, Max, and welcome. So, yes, Patreon keeps giving me pleasant surprises, and the moral support aspect of it is every bit as important as the financial support. So, lots of reasons to be in a good mood today, and so let's get to the weekend review. I've been very busy in the video department. Let's get into what's actually on the list, and the first one is by a writer that I remember you being lukewarm about in the past, and that's David Bergen, and his novel is called Away from the Dead.
Oh, I do not want to read anything by David Bergen again because I had such.
Oh, so I think more than lukewarm or less than lukewarm. What would that be? Anyway, it's more of adverse.
I'm hot.
You're hot in a bad way.
And I fell for this trilogy so hard. I just loved it so much. You know, my life could be very boring, and I spend a lot of time just like looking after small children and not going out, not really doing anything, not seeing people. Like long stretches of my life are just not much going on. And these books just were such maybe also it was a bit sort of COVID time as well, and there was something I was really just like wanting to just escape from. Anyway, I just fell into this world so happily. I love these characters so much. I lived and breathed. She's such a brilliant writer as well. She's so good. So often fantasy, it feels like it's sort of maybe they've thought a lot about the world building, but they haven't really thought that much about the characters, and they don't really have a lot of depth. You know, maybe they do a thing, or they some event happens or whatever, but the actual character, like who are they? What makes the kind of light and shade of them?
So I think if you like Korean literature and something a bit quirky and that's quite, I thought it was very strong. It really made me think, and it was, yeah, it just is one of those books that haunts you after you finish reading it. So that's YN by Esther Yi, and it was praised there was a recent book review by Kat Jang, and the title of it was Finally Some Freaky K-pop Writing, because she was saying a lot of the writing about K-pop is so sanitized and they're seen as very safe and very
wholesome. And
yes, and so this one goes a bit more freaky in her words. So that's YN.
Okay, well, so it's time for me to come out of the closet because you obviously don't know me as well as you thought you did, Anna. I love K-pop.
Oh, you do? Oh, Sean, this is the book for you then.
And he talks about finding copies of his books in the used bookstore, some of which he signed to friends or acquaintances. And that just the way he wrote about that, I thought it was so touching and funny.
Yeah. I've always thought about that when I've found signed books, like personalized signed books at used bookstores. I always think how like funny that is. But his point, he makes a good point, and I do think it's nice the way he says, like, you know, like it's nice that at least the books look read, and it's nice that they get passed on from one reader to the next.
That's right. And that he just automatically assumes, well, they obviously enjoyed it very much, but they just didn't have room on their shelf for it. All right. So now, in terms of books, I believe I have one Bale to tell you about. I've finished 3, and then I'll talk about some others. Sadly, I couldn't finish this elderly lesbian novel. It just didn't work for me. Dot and Ralfie by Amy Hoffman. As I said in my Goodreads review, it just kind of skittered across the surface of the story. I didn't feel 40% of the way in that I had really, the characters were realized enough. The humor was really kind of surface level humor, and too much of it read like a script for a TV show. It was just dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. And the dialogue was meant to carry the story. Like, the dialogue wasn't particularly witty. It was kind of info dumpy dialogue. It was starting to really bug me, so I knew that it was time to get out. And so I got out. It has a pretty low rating on Goodreads, and I guess I now understand why, but I gave it an honest try. This Friday Reads is going to be a little ranty. Fasten your seatbelts, because 2 of the 3 books I finished, I wasn't very happy about either. This was a buddy read with Heidi of My Reading Life, Voting Day by Clare O.D. I talked about it quite recently, because I read it fairly quickly, over 2 weeks, and this is this novella set in Switzerland on the day that, in 1959, that they held a referendum about whether or not to give women the vote, in the lives of 4 female characters on that day. A brilliant premise, one of the worst books I've read this year. I pretty much hated it. The only successful chapter was the first one, as I said last week, and the rest of it just pissed me off. It was just so poorly executed. And Heidi doesn't agree, so that's great. And you should listen to her opinion more than mine. I just thought it was a pretty awful work of literature. And now that I've thought about it, because you might remember that last week on my Friday Reads, I was hanging all my criticisms on the fact that when it moved from the first character who was rendered in third person to the next character, her daughter, who was in first person, that was the flaw. But no, that's not the flaw. It was just a really inept use of first person. Let's see. Third chapter was first person, and it didn't bother me as much, but I didn't like that chapter by the end. I kind of hated the way it ended. And then the next chapter was third person, and it was one of the worst ones. So, yeah, I have to say, this is the second Fairlight Modern book I've read, and it may be my last, because there was a Romanian novella that I read a few years ago that I don't remember if I finished it, but it was dreadful. However, Fairlight also published that ekphrastic novella, the one that Lindy and I did a chat about, by Douglas Bruton. Here's the cover. That's one of the best books I've read this year. But it wasn't in the modern series, although Douglas Bruton has one in the modern series. But this, I thought, was really ineptly executed. What drove me crazy near the end, the fourth character was a social worker who was also a suffragist. What made me want to puke was that day, all of the action of the novel took place, except for the epilogue, on the day of the referendum. The referendum failed, by the way. The women in Switzerland didn't get the vote for several more years after that, which is obviously just disgusting. But this adult social worker, suffragette, feminist, and her adult brother are having tea or having dinner together. And the conversation between them was so stilted. Like, I almost bailed, even though I was at 80% or 90% of the way through, when her brother asks her, "So when did you first become interested in this movement?" He's her brother. He would know. They've been together their whole lives. Why would, it was just like, if you're going to dump information that way, oh, Jesus, that just, ugh. I thought it stunk. The first chapter showed that this person, Clare O.D., can write, but I don't know what happened for the rest of the book. I feel almost as negative about this one because it started out so good, but I'm going to chalk both of them up to the fact that I haven't been at my physical or emotionally balanced when I was reading these 2 books, but I really feel that my review is absolutely correct of that Voting Day piece of crap. But this one, I'm going to allow some more leeway because Jo loved it, or she really liked it, let's put it that way, and I could only muster 3 stars for it. Betty Miller, On the Side of the Angels, 1945 novel about military doctors and their wives, and then all the other military people in a British town. None of them have been deployed. Any of them could be at any time. There was getting bombed from the Germans quite regularly. It was a wartime novel that wasn't set in the middle of the action. And in many ways, it was a fascinating portrayal of the fetishization and the gender stuff that comes up anytime anybody puts on a uniform, and really quite a deep exploration of those. That didn't end up working for me because I thought it was so overwritten. And so if you like Henry James, my dear friend Joe does, I can't stand him, you probably like this book. Too many of these sentences gave me a headache. While I appreciated some of the writing, by the end I was sick of it, and I just thought it was too precious, too pretentious, and it detracted almost utterly from my enjoyment of anything else. The psychological insights are profound, but they're expressed in such abstruse Henry James-esque spidery sentences that you needed to read them 3 times to understand them. And this is maybe a comment on my diminishing IQ than anything else. It's really well done. I couldn't give it anything less than 3 stars, but I didn't enjoy it. By the end, it was a book that I didn't enjoy really at all. It also suffered, I thought, from some terrible dialogue, not in the way that this one did, but just there was a pretentiousness of the conversations between some of the characters that just struck me as being so unreal. One of the main characters and her fiance, and the way he would just spout his philosophy at her. I mean, that's, again, it's pretty Jamesian, but it just made me gag in places. However, listen to Jo Smith because she enjoyed it scads more than I did. In much happier news, I have finally finished this collection of gay male short stories by Richard Hall, Letters from a Great Uncle and Other Stories. It was published way back in the 80s, I think, maybe even... I never know what it means when there's 3 copyright dates, 77, 84, and 85. So I guess 1985, or this edition is 1985. That is always confusing to me. Richard Hall was born in 1926 and he died shortly after this, I think. I believe that Richard Hall and his lover both died of AIDS in their late 80s or early 90s. This was a very fine collection of short stories. One of my subscribers and patrons, Paul, raved about them. These are stories that are, in a way, these stories did not feel dated to me, but these are stories that portray a generation of gay men, I would say, earlier generation than me, maybe even 2 generations before me, where homophobia was still so rampant in America that their lives were quite closeted, and they found refuge, and it's still true today, but to a much lesser degree, and they found refuge and expression in their sexuality, and I mean that in the most active sense of sexuality, although these are not graphically sexual stories at all, but also in the arts. Several of these stories are about very talented gay male musicians. Also, many of these stories are about excavating queer history, and that was really well done. I gave this collection 5 stars because I thought it was so not only competent, but affecting. I believe Richard Hall only wrote short stories, but I don't know that. Let's see. Oh, that's not true. So there's more of his stuff to read than I knew. Yeah, his first novel was The Butterscotch Prince in 1975. That's a modern class. That's a queer classic. He was the first openly gay critic ever admitted to the National Book Critics Circle. 3 short story collections, including Letter from a Great Uncle, a novel, Family Fictions, and several plays. He died in 1992. Yeah, so there's plenty more for me to discover. And in particular, I thought the title story, Letter from a Great Uncle, was outstanding. So thanks, Paul, for giving me a nudge to finally read the whole collection. I think I might have read the first story years ago, but I don't remember that. But now I have. All right, so that's what I finished. I'm going to tell you about 3 books that I've gotten a ways into. All started quite recently. One is The President and the Frog by Carolina de Robertis, who is a Uruguayan-American lesbian novelist, and her first novel, at least the one that I think it's her first novel, Cantoris, I absolutely loved. And this is a very different novel. I'm going to have a pseudo-buddy read type Zoom chat with Elba of Syriella in a few weeks' time. So I've got my reading cut out for me, but it's quite an easy read in the sense that it's not densely written. In the present of the story, it is the ex-president of a certain Latin American nation, possibly Uruguay, but nothing is specified. So in his retirement, he is revered the world over, and in fact more outside his country than in. He's being interviewed by a Norwegian reporter. That's the present narrative so far. And then the backstory, the other narratives in alternating chapters, is him in prison in solitary confinement before he became president, where everybody knows basically what solitary confinement can do to the mind, and so he starts hallucinating, or does he, and he starts dialoguing with a frog. I think the writing is superb. It's so different from Cantoris that it's hard to even, other than the fact that the writing is really good, to think that it's the same writer. Both were politically preoccupied, but so far there's no eroticism in this one, and I'm enjoying it. It's going to be interesting to see what Elba and I make of it when we talk about it on Zoom in the coming days. I have started that Korean American novel, YN, by Esther Yi. And now that I've put up the podcast episode of Books on the Go with Anna, you will, if you've listened to that, you'll know that that's the book that I've chosen from the 3 she recommended to me in that episode, and that's why I'm reading it. And I'm enjoying it a lot. I think it's going to end up being a success for me. I'm 30% of the way in. Do you know what? I almost bailed in the first chapter because there were so many, like over a 2-page spread, there were about 3 or 4 really awful sentences. And I have been known to and feel fully justified in bailing. One terrible sentence, I have bailed on a book and feel that that is morally defensible. But I did keep reading because I had a kind of commitment, although Anna is as notorious a bailer as I, and she had told me in advance she wouldn't be the slightest bit put out if I bailed, but I kept reading for a few more pages, and by then I just got sucked into the story, and there were less and less. I think that the editor just fell asleep in the first chapter because I haven't encountered very much. I think it could have done with a closer edit, but most of the writing is really good, and it's a really spellbinding read. So it's about this young woman who doesn't think she has the time of day for K-pop, but she gets sucked into going. She gets convinced by her roommate to go to a K-pop boy band concert because her roommate's best friend got sick and couldn't go, and she just gets swept up and becomes obsessed with one of the boys and starts watching him on Instagram Live and this and that, and then it gets quite hallucinatory in a way that's, so far, I'm finding really gripping, because it's not just a realistic story. There's lots of kind of surreal things that are happening, and so far it's sweeping me along. It's very, very clever. I would say it's extremely well done. Could have used a bit of an edit on the sentence level here and there, but I think it's going to be a hit for me based on the first third. Oh, and I want to check in on this gay novel from a writer from the American South, The Dove in the Belly by Jim Grimsley. I have read quite a few chapters of it, and it is set in North Carolina. In fact, it's a campus novel set on the University of North Carolina, and in the 70s, mid-70s. So about 10 years before I came out, finding it really relatable as somebody who came out on campus. I like the writing. I like the way the characters are emerging. Our protagonist is kind of a closeted but sexually active young gay man on campus. His mother has gotten married for the 4th time or something like that, and said he can't come home for the summer. He has to stay in town. And where is the University of North Carolina? I don't know. Durham, maybe? And so he can't stay in dormitory. So he's just moved into a boarding house with a wonderful old woman who's suffering a little bit from dementia, but is still mostly there, who is just adorable. I love her already. He's got a totally effed up relationship with somebody on the football team or some sports team, I don't know, who treats them quite brusquely in public, but they have a sexual thing or a romantic thing. It's not clear to me yet what they have, and that's going to be a big part of the story. I am quite taken with it. I have to say that I'm not usually a fan of campus novels, but so far this one's hitting me just right. So I finished 3, bailed on 1. I get to start 4 more, even though I should probably not start 4, but I've got more than 4 that I want to get to, people. So first let me tell you about the one that I'm liable to forget because it's going to be on ebook. It's Bad Art Mother for Stray September, the Australian readathon that Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot is hosting. Bad Art Mother by Edwina Preston. The only way I can get my hands on it is by ebook ordered directly from the Australian publisher, so I'm going to start that this week. And now I can't remember exactly how I found out that Anna Bailey-Karras, the co-host of Books on the Go and my long-term friend on Bookish social media, how I found out that she loved this book. I think it might have been in our Zooming In chat, or else I heard her talk about it on a podcast episode. But however she transmitted that information to me, I found out that the University Library had it. So I'm going to read it for Shorty September. It's a play by Tom Stoppard. I think it's his most recent. Leopoldstadt. I think it's quite recent. This book looks like it. This physical book looks like it's never been read. Yeah, 2020. It's set in Jewish Vienna in the early 20th century, so that sounds fabulous. Now, to finish up this Friday Reads, here are the 2 buddy reads I'll be starting with my buddy readers extraordinaire. With Joe Smith, we are going to buddy read this Sudanese novel from NYRB Books, Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih, translated from the Arabic by Dennis Johnson Davies. The narrator comes back to the Sudan after studying in Europe in the 1960s, eager to make a contribution to post-colonial Sudan, and that's the premise of the story. It's a short little novella. It's been on both Joe's and my TBR forever, so we decided to fit it in for Shorty September. And at the very beginning of this year, if I'm remembering the date, if I'm remembering that detail correctly, Heidi and I read a book called Boys in Oil, which was a pretty unsuccessful memoir about a gay man coming out in like North Dakota or something, and also getting involved in the environmental movement. And it was really quite poorly done. We were more frustrated with it than not. But one of the writers that he mentions that influenced him to get involved in environmentalism was this essayist, Paul Gruchow, and we were both interested in his writing. So here we are, at the end of the year, buddy reading a collection of his essays. Grassroots, The Universe of Home. Milkweed Press, 1995. And these are environmental essays in the tradition of Wendell Berry and Rachel Carson. The essays are very short. I think there's probably 20 or more essays divided into 4 sections. So we're going to read a section a week. So tell me what you've been reading. What's been the best thing you've read for Shorty September or otherwise in September? I would like to know. And thank you for watching.